Hello everyone, happy hump day. Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve deeper into the top stories taking place not only in South Korea but across the globe. I'm Kim Bo-kyoung. After North Korea defined South Korea as an undoubted enemy and called for efforts to exponentially increase its nuclear arsenal and mass-produce tactical nuclear weapons, the Peninsula has fallen into escalated tensions. A mass rally took place in Pyongyang last week with hundreds of thousands of people showing firm determination to adhere to the goals laid out in the plenary meeting. And so, eyes were on January 8th, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's birthday, whether there might be some major provocations proving how firm the regime is. But in the end, January 8th was rather quiet. Why was the reclusive regime so silent? Should we pay attention to other dates in near future? And what is North Korea's situation like right now? For an in-depth analysis on the isolated regime that is close but feels far away, we have Dr. Go Myung-hyun, Senior Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, in the studio with us. Hello, Dr. Go.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Shariz Reddy, correspondent at NK News Seoul, also in the studio with us. Shariz, thank you for your
Thank you for having me here.
Right. Now, Dr. Go, first question to you. Last Thursday, North Korea held a mass rally in Pyongyang with some 100,000 people showing firm determination to thoroughly implement the policy goals which were laid out during the plenary meeting late last year. Is this a usual event?
Well, like mass gatherings organized by the state in North Korea is actually very frequent. We have to understand that this hasn't been a spontaneous gathering of people to support the government's policy. This was essentially ordered by the North Korean regime and to people in Pyongyang to come to this stadium in Neungna Island, or called the Neungna-do May 1st Stadium. By the way, the reason why 100,000 people gather for this event is because the capacity in the stadium is with 100,000 people. So this clearly, the stadium was filled to the capacity, and the entire messaging repeats what the government had decided in North Korea. And the reason why North Korea this time around had to somehow showcase this gathering is because there's a domestic component in the recent policy announcements. So even though the military line that the Kim Jong-un himself announced received most spotlight, especially when it comes to exponential increase in the nuclear production, nuclear weapons production. There's also a domestic component, which is essentially encouraging the North Korean society to increase domestic production, especially in agricultural production. So I think that's the reason why North Korea had to highlight the gathering of people, because this will be employed in the North Korea's own domestic propaganda.
Right. Since Dr. Go brought up the domestic component, now, Shariz, during the mass rally, 12 sectors where party expects improvement to be made in 2023 were unveiled, and of course, propaganda posters were rolled out, each focusing on the key sectors like agriculture and fishing. Now, would this mean that the North Korean economy is one of the top priorities for this year?
Well, as far as state propaganda goes, the economy is always one of the top priorities. It's something that does come up quite a lot in state media. To some extent, it was perhaps a little surprising that the end-of-year party plenum report did not perhaps mention the economy as much as it has in the past, but that's where these posters, this event, come in, and they end up showcasing the state's focus on the economy, on agriculture. But at the same time, I think we have to say that while the leader, while state media will continue promoting these narratives, and they'll always be relevant, particularly during a period of food shortages and other economic concerns, at the same time, the long-term strategy might not necessarily always reflect that. And Kim Jong-un has in the past said that there are overriding implications in terms of military spending, and that military development will certainly continue. And alongside that, perhaps we can expect that maybe the economic aspects will not necessarily filter down to the average North Korean person.
Okay, well, I need to ask you more on the posters. Now, according to NK News, it stressed that authorities are planning to hold major state celebrations on two dates, which are July 27th, which is 70th anniversary of victory in the Fatherland Liberation War, And of course, September 9th, the 75th National Founding Anniversary. Now, would this mean that any major provocations, even including, the 7th nuclear test, might happen around those dates?
Well, I think when it comes to major state celebrations, which is what they're looking to hold, chances are the focus will be more domestic. What do you do to keep North Korean people happy and what works for them? So there might be more focus on events being held around the country, particularly in large cities like Pyongyang and other places, for the people. But also we may possibly see a military parade at an appropriate event on an appropriate occasion. So I think there will be more of a domestic focus. Of course, we cannot rule out a nuclear test or other military activities, but it's one of those things where we've seen for the past year or so, lots of people have made predictions about when the nuclear test would happen. None of them have come to pass yet. So the basic thing is when North Korea is ready and wants to do it, it will do it. And for now, the most we can do is keep watching for the signs.
Right. Now, we cannot leave out Kim Jong-un's birthday, which was on January 8th. I mean, North Korea stayed rather silent with no other major provocations. Why is this?
So I think it has probably some connection to what's going on inside North Korea right now. There's some announcement, like a disclosure or like a news story in the official media in North Korea that Kim Jong-un was losing sleep over the hardship that the people are suffering in the country. And I think it's a reflection that because of sanctions and also because of the COVID-19 related public health measures that led to the closure of the border, which hampered the trade with China, it's very likely that North Korean people are suffering from shortages of all kinds of products, and possibly there are signs of a humanitarian crisis taking place, probably in the interiors of the country, which already suffer from, they have always been vulnerable to shortages in food productions. So I think Kim Jong-un is probably thinking that it's not a moment for him to celebrate his birthday when, because it's going to have it's not going to look good optics-wise, and then probably also he's taking into consideration the possibility of discontent among the North Korean population right now.
So he thinks now is not a proper time to celebrate his birthday.
That's probably likely.
Right, but I still wonder, the reclusive regime officially commemorates the birthdays of Kim Jong-un's late grandfather and his father, naming the as Day of the Sun and the Day of the Shining Star. But why didn't North Korea yet designate Kim Jong-un's birthday as official, or former anniversary?
So it's a reflection of Kim Jong-un's own personal style. He came into power and he promised people that he'll be different from his father or grandfather, even though there are clear efforts on the part of the regime, very systematic efforts on the regime to somehow create a connection or resemblance between Kim Jong-un and his grandfather, or the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. But then I think Kim Jong-un wanted to put North Korea in a way that, convinced not just the outside, but also the people in North Korea that he was a different kind of leader, that he's a leader who's going to take North Korea towards the future, meaning even the propaganda is going to reflect that. That's the reason why under Kim Jong-un, North Korean propaganda has become more modern. It has developed some styles that actually wasn't that actually quite unfamiliar to North Korean people maybe, but they was familiar to us. For instance, North Korean propaganda now uses YouTube. So they are more technically savvy, and also they are more in tune with the rest of the ongoing media trends in the world. So I think Kim Jong-un and his advisors are probably thinking that it's not yet time for Kim Jong-un to harken back to the old types of propaganda where there's strong elements of cult of personality. There are signs that the regime is trying to create a cult of personality around Kim Jong-un, but clearly that effort is kind of half-hearted. Because I think Kim Jong-un probably thinking that given his age, he's only 39, even if he starts with a cult of personality, it's not going to be very convincing. So perhaps the regime is waiting until later when the Kim Jong-un is much older, when they start with the old style or more traditional style of North Korean propaganda. But for now, I think they are trying to keep their propaganda style commensurate with the age of their leader.
Right, interesting. Now, though it was quiet, North Korea has reportedly tightened its security by putting a special security period from January 6th to 10th, which is 2 days longer than usual. And of course, the security and patrol personnel also doubled. Now, reflecting on what Dr. Ko said, is it related to, Kim Jong-un's health?
Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind when we see reports like this is it's worth considering where they came from, and so whether it may be possible to, it may be necessary to take them with a grain of salt. So in this case, the report that you mentioned, it's one of those reports that goes with an anonymous source, and that's about it. We can't necessarily verify what is actually going on. Similar to the situation last year as well, these reports come out every year around his birthday. That said, of course, we cannot completely rule out that these things are happening, but there could always be other reasons, local or national level, which could be affecting it. I wouldn't necessarily put it down to Kim Jong-un's health or speculate about other security factors, but it may be worth taking a look at what else comes out that may influence decisions like these. In this case, I think it was also in the report that in question mentioned, it was in the South Pyongyang province, which is in the center of Korea, but on the west coast. So it's always possible that there could be other activities that may affect that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Go, there were signs that North Korea had shown that they are preparing a military parade at Birim training ground last month. And pundits originally speculated that it is going to take place on January 8th on Kim Jong-un's birthday, but it did not. So could we say the military parade is slated for February 8th, which is 75th anniversary of the founding of the Korean People's Army?
Oh, that's really likely next date for North Koreans to stage a parade. But by now, it's quite clear that the North Koreans are holding so many parades that even if they are having a parade exercises, probably it has become some sort of a permanent exercise regime for whoever is participating in these parades. And I think, but then the reason why it's likely that the North Koreans are going to hold a parade on February 8th is, first of all, because the date actually celebrates the establishment of North Korea's People's Army.
Right.
That's the first reason. And second is North Korea has shown patterns in the past where instead of carrying out actual provocations, sometimes they substitute that with a parade. So for instance, until 2017, instead of launching an ICBM, what they did is that they showcased a new model of ICBM. Back then, there was the prototype of Hwasong 17, which they tested last year. They showcased those in the 2017 in a parade. So and then 18 as well. So in that sense, I think it's possible for North Koreans to hold a parade because they are probably thinking that because the much anticipated seventh nuclear test hasn't been realized yet, or maybe for whatever reason they think that it's not the right time for them to have that test. So perhaps instead they're going to hold a parade and they may showcase another new weapon system.
Right. So we'll have to wait and see. Now, now moving on to Pyongyang's recent provocations against South Korea, some say North Korea is following China's provocation patterns against Taiwan. I mean, is there really similarities between these two? And if there are, why is this so?
Well, I think there are perhaps some similarities, but also a lot of differences. And I think you can also argue that perhaps China is doing what North Korea has been doing for a long time, because North Korea is largely following its long-established pattern of provocations, just perhaps intensifying them a little more with, as we saw last year, there were a record number of missile launches. But in terms of how they're operating, it's still the same kind of provocations that we have been seeing for years, if not decades. And so that, I think, is certainly going to continue, as opposed to China, where usually the China-Taiwan relation is marked by different kinds of tensions, but the military escalations mostly happen after long intervals. So like during the mid-90s, we saw a major escalation, and now again, in the last year, there's been much higher activities. But in that, there is a similarity in how the two countries have operated over the past year, in that China largely started escalating after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And so both countries have been using US activities in the region as an excuse for ramping up their own military activities. And so it's part of perhaps a wider anti-US front that we're seeing in this region. And both sides are likely to continue using the US as an excuse to increase such activities.
Right, using US as an excuse, that is a similarity, right?
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Go, North Korea's drone infiltration into South Korean airspace caught defense officials quite much off guard. And there are still ongoing concerns and discussion over whether our national security is fine. I mean, are South Korea's defense capabilities okay right now? And should there be any improvement made?
So I think one of the misconceptions about the recent drone infiltration into the South Korean airspace is that the South Korean military was caught off guard by this infiltration. In fact, the South Korean military knew that these drones were approaching the South Korean airspace from North Korea, and that they've been able to track those drones while they were in the South Korean airspace. I would say that was actually a very significant improvement from the last time the North Koreans were found sending their drones into the South Korean airspace. The most recently was in 2017, and the only reason why South Korean military found those drones back then was because they had crashed. So this time, the military has been able to track them in real time. So that's a positive development. So what was lacking was clearly the South Korean military didn't have a policy or tactic to handle this kind of situation. What I mean is whether the South Korean military would shoot down those drones. And then I think the South Korean military was probably engaged in a cost-benefit analysis. What I mean by this is that the South Korean military was probably aware that these drones didn't represent a lethal threat against the South Korean security. It's probably a very small drone, meaning that it wasn't able to carry a significant payload, meaning it wasn't probably unarmed. So then they had to essentially make the calculation over whether to shoot it down with the possibility of having collateral damage on the ground in the South Korean side. And so probably they judged that that wasn't worth it. But clearly there was a political fallout from this incident. So I think the potential countermeasures that the military can come up in the near future is using so-called non-kinetic means. By non-kinetic, what it means is that there are ways to counter this kind of threats without using actual firepower. So for instance, they can use jamming using electronic warfare systems to jam the signal. So even like undermining the guidance system in those drones, and then cause those drones to fall to the ground. So this is one way, and it's actually been tested already on the real actually scenarios. So it's possible that the South Korean military is going to use those kind of tactics in the near future. These are already technically available, so it's all a matter of implementation.
Now, what I want to point out is that under the Yoon administration, South Korea is adopting tit-for-tat policy to respond to North Korea's provocations. How do you see Peninsula to be in 2023?
No, I think the tit-for-tat response is actually comes from the fact that South Korea has long been implementing this policy of a proportional and equal response to North Korean provocations. And then more I emphasize the period of the time phrase, a long time. The reason why this should be emphasized is because North Koreans should have no misunderstanding about how South Korea is going to respond to their provocations. Therefore, the reason why there should be no misunderstanding is because when South Korea responds to North Korean provocations, one of the possibilities that they are very aware of is the possibility of escalation. And then neither side, even North Korea probably doesn't want their provocation to escalate out of control. So I think this tit-for-tat response, even though sounds negative, overall it has been an established pattern of like a response and counter response between the two Koreas for a very long time. So the point here is that as long as it remains a tit-for-tat, it means that the escalation will be under control, and meaning that there will be stability of some sort between the two Koreas. So if that's indeed going to be the case in 2023, it's going to be a good news. What's going to be a bad news is for North Korea to mount a surprise attack against the South Korean civilians to the military. But then it seems like the signs that the North Koreans are showing so far is that they are escalating. No, they're not escalating. They are actually launching provocations that are very significant, but then at the same time, it remains under the threshold of escalation. For instance, if the drone incursion represents such an example, North Korea sent in an unarmed drone to South Korean territory in a way to embarrass the South Korean government, but then because it was unarmed, the North Koreans betrayed the intention that didn't want to escalate out of control. So it means that in 2023, North Koreans might engage in such provocations that has some political significance, but then they probably refrain from carrying out very aggressive actions that could cause an escalation.
Wow, it's interesting to hear how this kind of tit-for-tat policy is actually an established pattern, and it could bring some sort of stability.
Exactly.
Right. Sure is. A recent study said that North Korea has the fourth largest army in the world, with 1.2 million active personnel behind China, India, and the United States. And of course, experts say the size of the military and the actual combat power are two different things. But what is your takeaway on this?
Well, that is correct, in that obviously North Korea has a huge army, but that does not necessarily mean that its overall combat power is as significant. Obviously, we should still take it seriously. It is an incredibly large army, twice the size of South Korea's armed forces effectively, and well trained. Plus, they also do have nuclear capabilities, let's not forget. But that in terms of their conventional warfare capabilities, we have to bear in mind that much of what they have, their equipment, is incredibly outdated, in severe need of upgrades, and certainly with sanctions, it is increasingly hard to account for these weaknesses. Much of the equipment dates back to the Cold War, what they got from the Soviet Union. So I think what we're seeing is in an actual combat scenario against a much better, more modern equipped country like, say, South Korea or the US, North Korea would end up suffering quite badly. That said, we still have to bear in mind that, as we have seen in Ukraine over the past year, simply being a superior military power does not necessarily mean any country will have it easy. North Korea in particular is one of those countries where they have spent a long time focusing on asymmetric warfare capabilities to be able to tackle bigger threats. So they will still, so let's not count them out entirely, but yes, in terms of combat power, they are far behind much more modern countries.
Right. There are still many questions I'd like to ask, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Shiraz, for your insights, and of course, thank you, Dr. Go, for your insights as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. Have a great rest of the evening. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories on the issues happening in South Korea and, of course, around the globe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.